All right, the next section we're going to work on is the content and aside sections. Now you can see there are two columns, so my content column is on the left and my aside is on the right. We already have our HTML in place for those. So if we jump back to our HTML, we have our section and we have our aside, and that's going to be the left column. This one will be the right column. Now just to illustrate right now, I'm just going to do a quick, in fact, I'll just fill some text here. So I'll just say content, and then down here in the aside, I'll say aside. Let's save and refresh this and see what we look like. And you can see right now they're on top of each other. So my content column is this entire element and my aside column is this entire element. They're both block, but I need them to be side by side. So here's where we're going to apply CSS floats and some clearfix tricks. So let's go ahead and get started to flesh out the left and right columns here. Now back to our HTML, you'll recall that this section has an ID of content. So I'm going to jump back to my style sheet, and we need to go down and create that content section because we haven't quite got that part fleshed out yet. So underneath the slider, let's create a new CSS rule. This is going to be pound content, and we'll open and close our curly braces there. And this element is going to have a specific width and height. Now if we come back here and look at our Photoshop document and we measure this section, recall we set this thing up initially on this grid system. So we have our guides and our grids back here, but we can just quickly measure this. Whoops, I still have this on fixed size. So I'm going to switch that back to normal and grab a marquee and draw over here. You can see that the width there is 600, looks like it's 620 or so, 620 pixels. I'm just kind of roughing that in. So we need to set up that height on our content section. So let's jump back here and we'll jump over into our content section and let's say width 620 pixels. And we're not going to set a height because the height will be determined by the amount of content inside of that area. So we will set a float. Blanked on the word there, I couldn't think of it. We need to set this thing to a float. And we're going to float this thing left. So if you don't remember what floats are, switch back to those HTML and CSS introductory videos and check out the sections on positioning and floats. They're quite a complex topic for people starting out. So we'll refresh here, and you can see right away that makes the content area stick over here to the left and the aside area by default is over here to the right. So we floated the content area left. Now let's create another quick rule here. I'm going to give these guys background colors so we can see them. Background color red, and we'll create another CSS rule for that aside, and you'll recall that the aside has this ID of side. So we'll jump back over here and come back to the bottom and we'll say pound side. This is going to have a width. We need to come back to our Photoshop document and measure its width. So it looks like this is 380 for the width of that column. So we'll say width 380 pixels. And we're also going to float this guy left, and we'll give it a background color of blue. Okay, so we'll save both of these. Let's jump back here and refresh. So you can see there how those are lining up. We have our content and we have our aside div, and that's looking pretty good. And now we need to introduce that middle gutter area. So we have a space between these two and fix the outside margins. Now let's jump back to the Photoshop mockup quick. You can see from our mockup that this content div, which is this entire section right here, has a little bit of padding. So the content, there's this little padding on the left and this little padding on the right edge and some padding on the top, maybe and bottom. But the most important is that left edge if we zoom all the way in here and look. So this is white, this is a slightly different color, but there's an inside padding on the left and right to ensure that that text doesn't run all the way against this edge, which makes it much more unreadable. So we're going to introduce in that padding also to this content div. So we'll jump back here and on this content div, let's add some padding. So we're going to do shorthand. So 0 is the top and bottom. And for the left and right padding, we're going to introduce 20 pixels of padding. Now this is going to add to our width because of the box model. So if I save and refresh, the content area now has 20 pixels of padding. You can see how now there's a space in between there. But now this div is too wide, so there's not enough room for the aside to fit over here. So what we need to do is we need to subtract that padding, 20 on the left, 20 on the right, for 40 from the width. So we're going to bump off 20 and 20. So we'll switch this thing to 580 to subtract the 40 pixels that are inside of the padding area, and save and refresh. And now you can see the aside fits back in there, and that's perfect. And one change we're going to make is we're going to take this aside div and float it to the right, so it sticks over here instead of the left, which will give us this nice gutter in between the two. So we'll take the side div and we're going to switch this to float right, and save and refresh. So now it's tacked over there, and we're going to do the same thing. We need to introduce in some padding on our aside div as well. So we'll come over here to our side div, and we're going to introduce the similar little padding. So we'll say padding. Let's say 0 on the top and bottom. In fact, it might be better to say 5 or something, maybe 10 pixels on the top, so the content doesn't bump all the way up against the top as well. We can always adjust those later. And on our side div, we'll add 40 pixels to the left and right padding. That makes it too big there. Oops, I wanted to make that 20 pixels, not 40. And then the same thing, we need to subtract the 40 pixels from the left and right. So we're going to jump this down to 320 instead of 340. I think that was 380 before. And save and refresh, and then it fits right in there. And there's that nice 20 pixels of padding on the left and right. And we have that nice gutter in the middle, which matches exactly up with our Photoshop document. We have that 20 pixels there, and everything's lining up pretty nice. So now, instead of having these solid colors, which we've included here, this red and this blue, let's go ahead and add in fact, we're going to add the 10 pixels in here as well, so we have that slight buffer above and below the content as well. Let's add in the colors from our Photoshop mockup. So we'll come back here and let's just sample this inner color. So I'll just get my eyedropper and sample that color, and come over here and copy that hex value, jump back to here, and that's going to be the background color. Instead of red, we'll make sure we do the pound sign, and instead of blue, we'll paste that color in, and save and refresh. Okay, so that's got those colors inside of there. Now that's looking pretty good. And the issue here now is that because we floated these two elements, they're no longer part of the document flow. So we need to apply what's called the clear fix hack, and we'll look at that in the next tutorial.